Those are cases. The line is cases. The little blue bars are deaths. Now, you may say, oh, Woods, that's not fair, because you know deaths lag by 2 weeks. You got to wait 2 weeks. Okay, that's why we shifted the deaths back 2 weeks, so that it would line up. So we already factored that into the graph. So when your smart aleck friend says, well, wait 2 weeks, we did. We factored that into this graph. And as you can see, there's no connection whatsoever. So do not panic about so-called cases. I don't know how it's possible after month after month after month of this that people still don't know that. But secondly, notice that this person on Twitter cannot admit that the voodoo doesn't work. It's always that the peasants didn't comply enough. If you stupid people would just obey us already, this thing would go away. Now, I understand why progressives go for that kind of thinking, because they have a superstitious belief in the powers of the state. So if the state says it can wipe out a virus, who's to say it can't? Secondly, it involves so-called experts dictating to the stupid rubes, and that's their preferred model of governance. Thirdly, it allows them to ridicule the working-class people they despise. Why, if only these backward hicks would follow the science, we'd be out of this thing already. But let's face facts. Lockdowns only delay the inevitable, and they leave wreckage in their wake. On Thursday of this week, Italy, which had a brutal and savage lockdown earlier this year, reported 428 deaths, which is the equivalent of 2,354 deaths in the United States. That's where so-called science got them. Now, because I am going to rush through a lot of material here, I'm going to refer you, if you want more, to my ebook called Your Facebook Friends Are Wrong About the Lockdown. Just text the word lockdown to the number 33444 and you'll get it. Or you can go to wrongaboutlockdown.com. Isn't it awesome, the domain names I managed to buy? Let's just take a few examples. Peru, Belgium, the UK, they had hard lockdowns and high death rates. Belgium and the UK are locking back down, as is much of Europe. Now, when the crazies are faced with this data, they try to claim that such and such country didn't lock down early enough. It can't be that lockdowns don't work. Remember, it's always that the stupid people didn't listen to the science, even though there is precisely zero science behind lockdown. Nobody's recommending lockdowns in any of the literature up to now. There's no guidebook on lockdowns. Well, the reason this lockdown didn't work is you didn't follow the... There is no rule book for lockdowns. Lockdowns weren't even a thing until 2020. And you certainly can't say Spain didn't lock down early and hard, or Italy for that matter, much as they try to. And now the same European countries whose insufferable intellectuals have been lecturing the U.S. for its handling of the crisis are seeing spikes in deaths again. In Italy and the UK, and here and there in other places, at least some people are fighting back. The last lockdown took everything they had. One video, which has gone viral, shows an Italian woman crying that she has lost everything and has nothing to feed her child. I guess she'd better listen to the science, right? What a sick, deranged cult this is. Now, the one word that is like a crucifix before Dracula to these people is Sweden. Sweden never locked down, didn't close businesses, schools stayed open, there was no mask mandate. Now, when you bring that up, you know what they're going to say. You already know. Oh, Sweden had a high death rate. That's immediately their response.
And so here's a free lesson. Johan Hillström from Sweden, who is a clinical exercise physiologist certified, reports, and obviously unfortunately I'm not able to read the original primary source here because I can't read Swedish. But for anyone who can, here's the source, and he says 2 Swedish investigating media groups have exposed a group that deliberately spread misinformation to international media in efforts to discredit the Swedish corona strategy. They have succeeded with this in Time magazine, Science magazine, The Washington Post, among many others. In their closed Facebook group with 200 members, including academics, opinion or thought leaders, researchers, and others such as media reporters who are upset about Sweden's non-compliant globalist strategy where they did not lock down, they did not destroy people's lives, they did not mandate social distancing or masks, they continued on as largely as normal. They coordinate activities, and this group of misinformation peddlers coordinate activities and take the messages to the comment fields in Twitter, Swedish, and mainly international media, which is where we've had the sleuth of all these news outlets claiming that the Swedish strategy was a disaster and that it was going to be mass death and all of this complete disinformation. It seems that the group has three main goals. One is to influence the Swedish corona policy, two is to criticize the media coverage of that policy, and three is to coordinate efforts to damaging the image of Sweden abroad and also damaging the reputation of individuals who work in this field, such as Professor John Ioannidis, Professor Sunetra Gupta, Professor Martin Kulldorff, Professor Jay Bhattacharya, and amongst countless others. The slander campaign comes from this shill media group of academics, opinion leaders, activists, researchers, and reporters.
Now, there are countries that locked down and ruined people's lives that had much worse death rates than Sweden, but leave that aside. About 75% of the deaths in Sweden occurred in their atrociously run nursing homes. Everybody gets that they're atrociously run and things need to be done about that. But when you factor that in, you realize that it's actually not that particularly bad of a death rate. My state of Florida did not lock down during the Sunbelt spike. The doomers have no explanation for how we got out of that. This very week, we recorded the lowest two-day death total since July. That shouldn't be possible. We have the fifth oldest population in the country, tourists coming in and out, we're completely open. We should be a basket case of non-stop death if the cartoon version were correct, but no. Now, there are lots of explanations for why this should be, but no one wants to listen to them. They want to hear the same. For some reason, people are allergic to good news in this. I've never seen anything like it. The other preferred form of voodoo, other than the lockdowns, is masks. We've been told that if only Americans had worn masks for 6 weeks, this whole thing would have been over quickly. The problem is, the charts don't bear this out. I mean, believe me, I wish masks could solve the problem. I wish just 6 weeks of that, and then that'd be great. But it turns out not so. All right, here's the UK. Now, the UK introduced a mask mandate. Let's try and guess where on that chart the mask mandate went into effect. Was it maybe up at the top? They put it in and said, okay, now we really need the mask mandate? It was there. Would you have guessed there? Could I have held a competition? See who could predict where the mask mandate was introduced? Spain. Okay. Well, I bet when they got all the way up there, they said, we sure need a mask mandate. Where'd the mask mandate come in here? Right there. So the whole thing's over, and then they said, let's put masks on. Okay, let's go on. Let's go to the next one. Italy. Okay, now Italy, I will tell you, in April, so right as it's starting to come down, they did say you have to wear masks in shops and on public transportation. But when did they require masks outdoors? Let's take a look. Right there. And as you can see, the virus has been wiped out. All they had to do was wear masks for 6 weeks. Let's go to the next one. France. Take a guess. Where do you think? Right there. Obviously, as you can see, the virus is gone. Just wear masks for 6 weeks. All right, let's keep going with the voodoo. Let's see. Belgium. All right. Obviously, right? All the data points to it. That's where the mask mandate went into. Let's keep going. Why the heck not? We got Germany. Where? Just as it's coming down, it's already coming down. So no doubt the masks get the credit for it coming. It was already coming down anyway. The state does this all the time. Things come down anyway on their own. They take credit for it. Let's keep going. Austria. Where? Maybe up at the top? Oh, no, here. And as you can see, the virus has been wiped out. Let's go to the next one. Okay, these are places that require masks in the black and places that don't. Now, Denmark has introduced some limited mask requirements here and there, but generally they've been discouraging masks. And isn't that funny? I thought by listening to the science and wearing masks, that would help slow the spread, and yet look at the red lines. These are places that don't require them, and oddly enough, they seem to be doing better. Okay, let's go to another one. Kansas City, when did they have their mask mandate? As you can see, the virus was suppressed. All right, let's move on. Montana, right there. We get masks, and then we get that. So then here's Montana versus Sweden. I'm just not being fair here. That's just not right. Okay, UK versus Sweden. Okay, UK going back up, Sweden doing fine. And this shows us where all the different things the UK tried to do while Sweden is still living normally. Czech Republic versus Sweden. Okay, when did the Czech Republic get its mask mandate? Probably way up there because they were panicked. Nope, they got one here, they got one there, and then it goes up and up. Okay, now this is a chart of 4 counties in Tennessee. Can you guess which one of them closed bars and limited restaurants to 25%? I mean, as you can see, one of those charts is radically different from the others. It's the one in the lower left, but who cares, right? It's obviously all the same. If anything, that one looks worse. So, who even understands?
Crucial viral update regarding mandatory masks, and although the gov.uk high consequence infectious diseases updated national infection prevention guidance does indeed recommend the widespread use of mandatory masks, this is going against all the prior decades of science, and it does indeed actually go directly in opposition to the decades of recommended guidance by the World Health Organization, based upon the Global Influenza Program for non-pharmaceutical public health measures for mitigating the risk and impact of epidemic and pandemic influenza, where the World Health Organization of 2019 guidelines finds the overall result of the evidence on masks, finds that 10 randomized controlled trials, which are indeed the gold standard for science, were included in the meta-analysis, which is indeed the highest tier of quality of evidence in scientific research, and there was indeed no evidence that face masks are effective in reducing transmission of laboratory-confirmed influenza, which is the closest seasonal respiratory viral impact compared to COVID-19. And they base this assertion on the quality of evidence that there is a moderate overall quality of evidence, which is not very conclusive, that face masks do not have a substantial effect on the transmission of influenza. The resource implications find that reusable cloth face masks, such as the government is recommending, are not recommended from the 2019 non-pharmaceutical public health measures from the World Health Organization. And if worn by a symptomatic case, that person might require multiple masks per day for multiple days of illness. So this systematic review comes from the CDC itself, published in May of 2020. And one of the main authors, Benjamin Cowling, he's done a number of these systematic reviews that I've covered here just in this section alone. And what do they find? What does the CDC itself find in their systematic reviews of the randomized controlled trials regarding face mask usage? Well, what they find is that reported estimates of the effectiveness of face masks in reducing laboratory-confirmed influenza in the community from literature published during 1946 until July 27, 2018. In their pooled analysis, we found no significant reduction in influenza transmission with the use of face masks. One study evaluated the use of masks among pilgrims from Australia during the Hajj pilgrimage and reported no major difference in the risk for laboratory-confirmed influenza virus infection in the control group or in the mask group. 2 studies in the university settings assessed the effectiveness of face masks for primary protection by monitoring the incidence of laboratory-confirmed influenza among student hall residents for 5 months. The overall reduction in influenza-like illness or laboratory-confirmed influenza cases in the face mask group was not significant in either of the studies. Study designs in 7 household studies were slightly different. One study provided face masks and P2 respirators for household contacts only. Another study evaluated face mask use as a source control for infected persons only. And the remaining studies provided masks for the infected persons as well as their contacts, close contacts. None of the household studies reported significant reduction in secondary laboratory confirmed influenza virus infections in the face mask group. Most studies were underpowered because of limited sample size, and some studies also reported suboptimal adherence in the face mask group. So there are limitations to a lot of these studies and randomized controlled trials, but yet it's the best evidence that we have, and they all conclude zero benefits whatsoever at preventing influenza-like virus infections in both the control and in the mask groups. From the CDC's own systematic reviews published in May of 2020. It goes further. Disposable medical masks are loose-fitting devices that were designed to be worn by medical personnel to protect accidental contamination of patient wounds and to protect the wearer against splashes and sprays of bodily fluids. There is limited evidence for their effectiveness in preventing influenza virus transmission, either when worn by the infected person for source control or when worn by uninfected persons to reduce exposure. Our systematic review finds no significant effect of face masks on transmission of laboratory-confirmed influenza. We did not consider the use of respirators in the general public or the broader asymptomatic community. Respirators are tight-fitting masks that can protect the wearer from fine particles, bacterial particles. They do not protect from viral particles, especially because the coronaviruses are 0.1 micron in size, and N95 masks only filter out up to 0.3 microns in size. Coronaviruses pass right through N95 filters. And should provide better protection against influenza virus exposures when properly worn because of higher filtration efficiency. However, respirators such as N95 and P2 masks work best when they are fit tested, and these masks will be in limited supply during the next pandemic. These specialist devices should be reserved for use in the healthcare settings only, and in special subpopulations such as immunocompromised persons in the community, first responders, and those performing other critical community functions as supplies permit. In lower income settings, it is more likely that reusable cloth masks will be used rather than disposable medical masks because of cost and availability. There are still few uncertainties in the practice of face mask use, such as who should wear the mask and how long it should be used for. In theory, transmission should be reduced the most if both infected members and other contacts wear masks, but compliance in uninfected close contacts could be a problem. Proper use of face masks is essential because improper use might increase the risk for transmission. Thus, education on the proper use of disposable use face masks is also needed. But we now know from all the other evidence that cloth disposable masks, especially reused, absolutely increases viral transmission. So there you have it. That's the official CDC systematic reviews of the best randomized, the gold standard of evidence, published in May 2020. The most recent Nelson VegSource posted this screenshot excerpt from this publication here from the European CDC on using face masks in the community. First update: effectiveness in reducing transmission of COVID-19, very recent, published February 15th of 2021. And in this screenshot here, we've just got highlighted some of the most important little pieces to note. Evidence regarding the effectiveness of non-medical face masks, in other words, cloth masks, for prevention of COVID-19 is scarce. We did not identify any interventional or observational study directly comparing the effectiveness of non-medical masks or cloth masks with that of surgical face masks versus a control group, which is no masks. So they have they did not identify any studies, and yet there is now the Denmark randomized control trial with the effectiveness of face masks versus no masks. So there are studies out there now, and those ones show no effectiveness of them, no significant effect of wearing face masks versus the control group. But that's aside from the point. as non-medical masks can consist of different types of material and be constructed of different, experimental studies on non-cloth face masks conducted in laboratory show inconsistent results with large variability in their efficacy. Limited indirect evidence from experimental studies show that non-cloth masks may decrease the release to the environment of respiratory droplets, although there is conflicting evidence about the relative efficiency of medical versus cloth masks. And the effectiveness in the prevention of COVID-19 in the community is small to moderate, and the certainty of evidence is very low. And so they open up with very clear assessment of the actual science from decades. The role of face masks in the control and prevention of COVID-19 remains an issue of debate in the scientific community. So for Facebook, YouTube, social media, any COVIDiots or anyone out there, public health experts claiming that this is conclusive, no, it's not. It's a hotly debated topic in the scientific literature and in the community. And the reason why is because of the decades. And so they explain here, prior to COVID-19, most studies assessing the effectiveness of face masks as a protective measure in the community came from studies on influenza. And that's absolutely true. That's absolutely true, which provided little evidence to support their use. That is absolutely true, as we know now and have shown. The technical report reviews the evidence that has been accumulated since the emergence of COVID-19, which again, the vast majority of that quote-unquote evidence is non-evidence. It's low-quality, theoretical, mechanistic modeling based on mannequin tests and hamster, very poorly designed tests on mannequins and very poorly designed just tests on hamsters, using a surgical mask to block transfer between hamster cages. In addition to what has existed on this topic prior to the pandemic and epidemics, the European CDC opinion on suitability of using face masks in the community, published on April 9th, 2020. Assessment of the evidence. The evidence regarding effectiveness of medical masks for the prevention of COVID-19 in the community is compatible with small to moderate protective effect. So in other words, basically nothing. And I mean, they're doing it just because they say it's better than nothing. But the problem is, if you don't have good, strong evidence, then there is I've shown you multiple studies that show the potential for masks actually to increase transmission, which the study that I showed you claims that could be beneficial. And that's not me saying that. That's the actual study that the World Health Organization cited to change their guidelines to widespread community mask recommendations for the healthy population. They cite that study. That's not me making some pseudoscientific, opinion. That's their own studies modeling that they have used to change their opinion. But there are still significant uncertainties about the size of this effect. Evidence for the effectiveness of non-medical or cloth masks, face shield visors, and respirators in the community is scarce and of very low certainty. And so based on this little to no lack of evidence, they still go ahead and recommend that everyone in the community wear face masks at all times in confined conditions, except for when outdoors. They even say it could be considered in crowded outdoor settings. For people vulnerable to severe, such as the elderly, in households is recommended. So they recommend all of this despite the fact that there is little to zero evidence of protective effect. So we then have this report from this study from the Journal of Orthopedic Trauma, which is orthopedic surgery, the Orthopedic Trauma Service and COVID-19, practice considerations to optimize outcomes and limit exposure, published on July of 2020. Although standard surgical masks may provide enough protection for the prevention of influenza and other viral respiratory infections in healthcare personnel, and they cite this study here, which actually finds no such thing anywhere in this study. Nowhere in the study does it actually cite or does it find that standard surgical masks may provide enough protection for the prevention of influenza or other viral respiratory infections in healthcare personnel. That is absolutely not what this study finds whatsoever. And that study is N95 respirators versus standard medical masks for preventing influenza among healthcare personnel, a randomized clinical trial, which yet again is the gold standard of evidence, published in September of 2019. And the study was conducted to find clinical studies have been inconclusive about the effectiveness of N95 respirators, which are the best, highest quality respiratory infection masks that medicine has, and medical masks in preventing healthcare personnel from acquiring workplace viral respiratory infections. Yet again, clinical studies have been inconclusive about the effectiveness of N95 respirators and medical masks in preventing workplace acquired respiratory infections from virals. And the main outcomes and measures of the study was the incidence of laboratory confirmed influenza. So this randomized controlled trial, the outcome was that it found laboratory confirmed influenza. Secondary outcomes included incidence of acute respiratory illness, laboratory detected respiratory infections, laboratory confirmed respiratory illness, and influenza-like illness. Adherence to the interventions was assessed. And they found that medical masks have no essential impact compared to respirators in prevention of respiratory viral infections such as influenza or influenza-like illness. They found a difference of 1% between surgical masks and N95 high-quality respirator masks. The conclusions and relevance of this randomized controlled trial among outpatient healthcare personnel N95 respirators versus medical surgical masks as worn by participants in this trial resulted in no significant difference in the incidence of laboratory confirmed influenza. And they found that 8% of N95 respirators still acquired laboratory confirmed influenza infection events. And they found that surgical masks found 7% of influenza-like respiratory viral infections amongst these healthcare personnel. So in other words, these masks did not provide prevention of respiratory viral infections or influenza-like confirmed laboratory illness. They found no such thing as claimed in this study here. Although standard surgical masks may provide enough protection for prevention of influenza and other viral respiratory infections in healthcare personnel, this study, this randomized controlled trial, found no such thing as claimed here. It goes on to say they may not be as effective as the N95 respirator in preventing infection with SARS-CoV-2. Of course they're not, because that study actually found that there was merely a 1% difference between N95 respirators and surgical masks. They found essentially no difference, although the surgical masks were 1% less effective, but they found that neither one of them were effective at preventing respiratory illness. So it found no prevention of infection, or at least it still didn't prevent respiratory illness from occurring in healthcare surgical settings. It goes on to say, standard surgical masks and respirators are assigned a fit factor, which is quantitative estimate of the concentration of substance in the ambient air to the concentration of the substance in the respirator when it's worn. Most standard surgical masks have a fit factor between 2.5 and 9, which is extremely low. That's extremely low, and that's essentially literally zero protection from respiratory illness. And it will go further. Adding additional surgical masks, that is wearing multiple masks, can increase the fit factor, but the fit factor is still less than 15, even when 5 masks are worn.
So is there
4
better?
is good.
Like it would be.
Yeah,
5?
I would say 10.
10.
We have 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I think 10
at a time.
10 masks are even better. Now, I am wearing 10 masks and my ears are collapsed. There we go. Okay, so now you can see it's not comfortable on the ears. But I am perfectly safe from any kind of spittle.
In addition, taping the surgical mask to your face improves the fit factor by only a factor of 2, which is essentially nothing. So even if you tape 5 masks to your face, it still provides almost no protection against respiratory illness. But regardless of these adjuncts, they do not meet the qualification of an N95 respirator and fall far short of the N95 respirator that has a fit factor of 100 compared to a factor of less than 15, even when 5 are worn and taped to your face. An adjunct that is included in the algorithm in the use of a surgical hood. It's important to note that a surgical hood has a fit factor similar to that of a standard surgical mask, which again is essentially nothing, but it does cover the entire face when used in conjunction with a surgical mask or N95 respirator to provide an additional level of protection when operating on high-risk patients. The N95 hood must be donned in an area that is free of aerosols to provide protection. Get this. Failure to do so may increase the risk of exposure to the wearer. So if you're not wearing an N95 and a hood in an area that's free of aerosols to provide protection, it actually increases the risk of exposure to the wearer. In several of the author's institutions, the N95 respirators are only being used for SARS-CoV-2 positive patients, or by members of the operative team only for high-risk aerosolizing procedures in SARS-CoV-2 unknown patients. In many of these institutions, the N95 respirators are being reused for several days. It is important to remember that the reuse of contaminated N95 respirator puts both the user and others at risk of potential spread of the virus. And so the majority of the population are simply using standard cloth masks, and they're reusing them for months at a time. Months upon months of reusing the same cloth mask, which is known to increase the spread of respiratory viral infections. And even so, even the highest quality masks, such as N95 respirators, still provide almost no protection, still don't prevent respiratory infection illnesses, even in a surgical setting. This chart is brought up by Daniel Levitt. Data is from the world's most prestigious medical journal, The Lancet, from the study Estimates of Global Seasonal Influenza-Associated Respiratory Mortality, a modeling study from 2018, who I believe is the son of Professor Michael Levitt, who is Nobel Prize-winning biochemist laureate, posted this chart from the 2015 flu-associated death rate and masks, where it is clear that Japan and China, which are both very thin and relatively comorbid-free countries compared to these fat and sick and diseased countries such as the United States and Germany, which are far more unhealthy based on lifestyle, much more diabetes, heart disease, obesity compared to these two thin, very far less comorbid countries, where these countries wear masks basically almost at a 95% consistency. And it shows that the two countries, Japan and China, actually have far more flu-associated mortality, where they also have far more high rates of mask wearing, a higher percentage of mask wearing pre-COVID-19, and and the U.S. and Germany did not have lower rate of flu-associated deaths compared to non-mask wearing countries. Despite these huge disparities in obesity and comorbidities, which should technically far dramatically increase the risk of mortality from flu-associated illnesses, despite wearing masks. And so so the evidence almost sort of suggests that high mask wearing actually increases respiratory illness death rates. since Japan and China have far higher rates of flu-associated mortality compared to the United States and Germany pre-2015, pre-COVID-19 years.
Unsurprisingly, the WHO, culmination of 100 years of pandemic management science, in October 19 said no recommendation to quarantine exposed individuals once a virus is out and about in a community or a region. Not recommended. Never mind quarantining or locking down of whole populations. They didn't even cover that because it would have been too absurd. But in February 2020, we threw out the rule book of a century and we copied China for whatever reason.
Based on the guidelines from the 2019 influenza epidemic and pandemic guidelines from the World Health Organization, that face masks should only be worn by asymptomatic, under conditionally recommended circumstances, and only under severe epidemics or pandemics to reduce the transmission in the community. And although these recommendations are based on zero evidence that this is indeed effective in reducing transmission, there is only mechanistic, which is not high quality evidence. It is the lowest quality evidence on the higher tier of hierarchy of evidence, scientific evidence. And this is only a plausibility, mechanistic plausibility for the potential effectiveness of this measure. And the quality of this evidence is moderate at best, based on lack of evidence, lack of effectiveness in reducing influenza transmission. The strength of this recommendation is only conditionally recommended, and it's only conditionally, under circumstantial, during severe epidemics or pandemics. And as we previously covered, as per gov.uk, that COVID-19 is a low severity disease, low severity pandemic or endemic respiratory virus, based on the no longer being considered a high consequence infectious diseases, as per gov.uk. In fact, this is why if you go to the official website of government.uk, www.gov.uk, the official government website for the United Kingdom, high consequence infectious diseases, the status of COVID-19, and the recent publication last updated June 17th of 2020, status of COVID-19, right here on the official government UK website. It's very simple to find actual raw data. You just have to stop watching the news, turn off the news, and start actually listening to the world's most qualified experts and the peer-reviewed literature. Status of COVID-19 as of 19th of March in 2020. So this was literally at the very beginning, before the lockdown madness. It was already declared by the government that COVID-19 is no longer considered to be a high consequence infectious disease, and this is exactly the truth, and this is exactly why the UK's overall yearly mortality is no different than 2008. The Four Nations Public Health HCID group made an interim recommendation January 2020 to classify COVID-19 as a high consequence infectious disease, but this was based on consideration of the UK HCID criteria about the virus and the disease, with information available during the early stages of the outbreak. Now that more is known about COVID-19, given all the raw data and all the actual published peer-reviewed science that we now have, which the news is not showing you, and they go out of their way to make sure that they hide all the raw data from you, and they spin a narrative and they scare you without showing you any actual published medical research, which is exactly why this report here from .gov.uk/government, this updated report of Appendix B, a PEA's evaluation grid for options to rapidly increase general social distancing, it lists a number of options for how to manipulate and coerce and socially engineer the general population to how to accept the new normal. And number 2 on this grid, on this list from the United Kingdom government, number 2 is to use the media to increase a sense of personal threat. In other words, how to use the media to use and promote social approval for their desired socially engineered behaviors for this new civilization based upon fear and scare tactics in order to get you to take medications, to force you to take forced medications and to allow them forced control over your entire life and your freedoms. To use the media to increase sense of personal threat to you. To use the media to scare the piss out of you. Years ago, it was actually the government of Australia had actually made it illegal for retailers and media or any type of official or for anyone to exploit the fears of the public by creating false and unfounded anxieties by trying to convince them that face masks were safe or protective against the original SARS outbreak. Retailers who cashed in on community fears, and they are cashing in. The clip that I'm looking for to show you, it was a perfect, roughly 4-minute example by this UK girl doing an amazing report that simply summarized and collated all of the research about the UK government and NHS PPE corruption and scandals going on, summarizing the multiple different egregious examples of corruption surrounding the PPE scandals, where the government utilize taxpayer dollars, somewhere to the tune of billions of dollars, to produce PPE, and they issued like millions of dollars in contracts. Politicians, including everyone from Keir Starmer, Priti Patel, especially Matt Hancock, and many more, literally issuing millions of dollars in contracts to just random friends and family businesses, such as a small insect and extermination company, to produce PPE, like a $19,000 insect extermination business got millions of dollars in contracts to produce personal protective equipment. And that was just one example. There's dozens of examples where they were issuing millions of dollars in contracts to their friends and their family businesses to produce PPE to companies that had no experience and had nothing to do with PPE production, as well as things like as well as reports from North Korea using slave labor to produce the UK's PPE. And so they were using taxpayer dollars to the tune of billions of dollars to produce PPE, and yet at the same time none of that PPE was actually getting to essential workers. So there was a shortage of PPE, and meanwhile all the politicians and their friends and family, corrupt businesses, were getting rich off of public taxpayer dollars to fund PPE that never even reached the frontline healthcare or the NHS that was supposed to be receiving that PPE. And the corruption just goes on and on and on and on about the scandals, the corruption, to stealing people's money to produce this PPE. The whole thing was a scam. I mean, it was thousands of frauds upon frauds upon frauds, on and on and on. But I can't find the actual clip, that original clip that I wanted to show you. I had originally posted it to my Instagram page, and I first saw it on Facebook Watch, but I can't find the clip because my main Instagram account was deleted. But the corruption goes on and on regarding PPE. Everyone is getting rich. All the politicians, the government, the NHS, they're all getting rich off of these $1 billion going to produce PPE that never even went to actually producing PPE. So everything that is happening today, as little as 17 years ago, was actually highly illegal. And anyone who cashed in on community fears about SARS by exaggerating the health benefits of surgical masks could face fines of up to $110,000. New South Wales Fair Trading Minister Reba Meager said yesterday warned that distributors and traders could be prosecuted if it was suggested that masks offered unrealistic levels of protection from the disease. I'm sure everyone would agree that it is un-Australian to profiteer off of people's fears and anxieties. There appears to be some debate about whether the surgical masks are able to minimize the effects of SARS. Ms. Meager said her department would investigate any complaints about false mask claims which concern the public. Penalties can range from fines of up to $22,000 for an individual and $110,000 for a corporation. Health authorities have warned that surgical masks may not be an effective protection against the virus. Those masks are only effective so long as they are dry, said Professor Yvonne Cossart of Department of Infectious Diseases at the University of Sydney. And they are only safe or effective for 20 minutes as long as they remain dry. And today we literally have articles being published claiming that they're made safer because they increase the humidity within the wearer's face, that they increase the humidity of the respiratory tract, and that is literally advised against in the 2019 World Health Organization guidelines against non-pharmaceutical interventions. Health authorities have, as soon as they become saturated with the moisture in your breath, they stop doing their job and pass on the droplets. Professor Cossart said that could take as little as 15 or 20 minutes, after which the mask would need to be changed. But those warnings haven't stopped people snapping up the masks and retailers reporting that they are having trouble keeping up with the demand. Mr. Bell agreed with Professor Cossart's assessment regarding the effectiveness of the masks. I think they're of marginal benefit. In a way, they give some comfort to people who think they're doing as much as they can to prevent the virus, which is just, it's a pseudo comfort. It's a comfort and an appeal to emotions, which is why the CDC's advertisement and all of these advertisements on the news are simply just saying, Joe Biden wears a mask, so therefore you should too, or I wear a mask because, etc., etc. They're trying to appeal to your emotions, and they're not showing you any actual scientific peer-reviewed randomized controlled trials or meta-analyses or systematic reviews. The world's largest randomized controlled trials, such as the Denmark study, which shows that they have marginal to little to no effect whatsoever. We were told you need 16 layers on your mask for it to offer 95% protection, Ms. Taylor said. Wear 16 masks. And the acceptability probability is high, the practicability is high if accompanied by all these other options as well. The affordability is high for this. The spillover effects could be negative by scaring the population by using the media narratives, and the equity is uncertain. To use and promote social approval for these desired behaviors.
So that's why people have to wear masks. That's why people need to practice the social distancing.
We did reach out to the WHO and CDC for clarification, but have not yet heard back.
I wear a mask because
Oh, let's see if they have any science to show in this.
I wear a mask because it's a tiny sacrifice to protect your freedoms. I wear a mask because it's a tiny sacrifice to protect your freedoms.
Tiny sacrifice to protect your freedoms.
Oh my God. Oh, what on earth?
I wear a mask because I can help stop the spread of COVID-19 in my community.
And although these recommendations are based on zero evidence that this is indeed effective in reducing transmission.
I wear a mask because I care about you, even if I don't know you.
I want to keep doctors, nurses, and other essential workers safe.
Oh God, all right.
I wear a mask because I can, but my baby can't.
So the baby is touching her mask, which is infecting the baby. It defeats the entire purpose. And it's trying to pull the mask off of her face so that it can see her face. Look, the baby is touching the mask. And that's why she's wearing the mask.
Staying protected from COVID-19 in space.
I wear a mask because I want to feel safe sending my kids back to school. My kids wear masks to keep their friends safe. My kids wear masks to keep their friends safe.
This statement from the CDC is absolutely, not only is it absolutely insane, it's actually legitimate medical, harmful and dangerous medical misinformation, because children and kids literally have a 0.0004 risk of hospitalization and severe COVID-19. It's literally a 0% risk of harm from COVID-19.
If you further focus on people who are less than 65 years old but have no underlying diseases, the percentage of deaths among these people, the share of deaths by COVID-19 accounted by these people is extremely tiny. New York City, it's only 0.6% of all deaths are in people who are less than 65 and have no other reasons to die, in a way. In France, it is higher. It is 2.6%. But actually, these data come from death certificates that have very limited information very often about many diseases. So probably this is an inflated rate. Italy, 0.7% is about right. Sweden seems high at 2.2%, but actually this includes only 4 other types of comorbidities, and there's many others. If these others had been captured, the rate would have been substantially lower.
The public health bodies in the UK have reviewed the most up-to-date information about COVID-19 against the UK HCID criteria. They have determined that several features have now changed. In particular, more information is available about the mortality rate, low overall. And there is now greater clinical awareness and a specific and sensitive laboratory test, the availability of which continues to increase. The Advisory Committee on Dangerous Pathogens is also of the opinion that COVID-19 should no longer be considered as a high-consequence infectious disease, because the consequence of COVID-19 is very low. It has very low mortality rates. But yet literally schools are having lots of outbreaks of bacterial strep throat in their throats and facial staph infections from having to wear masks all day long. They have 0.000 risk of harm from COVID, but they have a high risk of bacterial infections such as strep throat and staph of the face and facial infections from these filthy masks being worn all day long. Same with medical professionals. That is dangerous medical misinformation right here being promoted as propaganda in the CDC advertisement. Are masks safe? Here's a whole other aspect of the cost to benefit analysis. Risks of surgical masks. Healthcare workers' surgical masks also were measured by personal bioaerosol samplers to harbor influenza virus. Various respiratory pathogens were found on the outer surface of used medical masks, which could result in self-contamination. The risk was found to be higher with longer duration of mask use, especially if you're reusing your masks all day or throughout the day, or even reusing it for multiple days. Surgical masks were also found to be a repository of bacterial contamination. The source of the bacteria was determined to be the body surface of the surgeons, rather than the operating room environment. So the bacteria was coming from their own body surfaces to contaminate their masks. Given that surgeons are gowned from head to foot for surgery, this finding should be especially concerning for lay people who wear masks. So surgeons who are gowned are contaminating their masks with bacterial contamination when lay people are just like infested with bacteria, which increases the risk of infections, facial staph infections, staphylococcus infections, other bacterial pneumonia infections. Without the protective garb of surgeons, lay people generally have even more exposed body surface to serve as source for bacterial contamination to collect on their masks. Risks of cloth masks. Healthcare workers wearing cloth masks had significantly higher rates of influenza-like illness after 4 weeks of continuous on-the-job use when compared to controls without cloth masks. increased rate of infection in mask wearers may be due to weakening of immune system function during mask use. Surgeons have been found to have a lower oxygen saturation after surgeries, even as short as 30 minutes. And of course, that doesn't mean all surgeons, it just means that there is evidence of it. Low oxygen induces hypoxia inducible factor 1 alpha. This in turn downregulates CD4 T cells, which are your immune cell. The CD4 T cells in turn are necessary for viral immunity. So it cranks down, it downregulates your immune system. Downregulation of T cells, bacterial infections, anxiety, fainting, weakening of immune function, claustrophobia, panic attacks, hypoxia, the list goes on. During walking or other exercise, surgical mask wearers had significantly increased dyspnea after a 6-minute walk than non-mask wearers. Researchers are concerned about possible burden of face masks during physical activity on pulmonary, circulatory, and immune system response due to oxygen reduction and air trapping, reducing substantial carbon dioxide exchange. As a result of hypercapnia, there may be cardiac overload, kidney overload, and a shift to metabolic acidosis. In other words, acidity of the blood. Risks of N95 respirators. Pregnant healthcare workers were found to have a loss in volume of oxygen consumed by 13.8% compared to controls when wearing N95 respirators. So you're getting less oxygen from the N95s, especially when worn all day long. And I know all the surgeons out there like Dr. Garth Davis are claiming, oh yeah, it's just uncomfortable, it's just an inconvenience, but you're actually, it has significant effect. It's not gonna kill you or anything. Unless you have severe conditions. 17% less carbon dioxide was exhaled, which means you're rebreathing it. Patients with end-stage renal disease were studied during use of N95 respirators. Their partial pressure of oxygen decreased significantly compared to controls and increased respiratory adverse effects. 19% of the patients developed various degrees of hypoxemia while wearing the masks. Healthcare workers N95 respirators were measured by personal bioaerosol samplers to harbor influenza virus. And 25% of healthcare workers' face piece respirators were found to contain influenza in an emergency department during the 2015 flu season.
I wear a mask because I want you to stay healthy.
I wear a mask because I really want to get a haircut soon.
Where have I seen this before?
Be awesome. Just say no. Don't let drugs screw up your life. It's expensive, illegal, and dumb. So when you're asked to join in, don't. Just say no. You're too young to die.
I wear a mask because I care about the health and well-being of those around me.
I wear a mask because I might not know that I'm sick.
Yo uso una máscara para mi familia y la comunidad.
I wear a mask because I want to keep others safe.
I wear a mask because I want to protect everybody.
I wear a mask because too many people who look like me are getting sick and dying from COVID-19.
I've grown fond of seeing people smile with their eyes. It's a beautiful experience in these times.
Okay. Oh my God. Oh, what on earth?
Hey,
okay.
Don't you owe it to yourself and your family to say no to drugs? Go ahead, say it. Say no drugs. All right, way to go.
Do it for their futures.
Even if you don't have to, I hope you choose to. Even if you don't have to, I hope you choose to. Even if you don't have to, I hope you choose to.
So that's why people have to wear masks. So that's why people have to wear masks.
So that's why people have to wear masks.
Where have I seen this before?
Consider use of social disapproval for failure to comply. In other words, getting your neighbors to report each other, to turn each other in for not wearing a mask or for not social distancing or for breaking the lockdown. It's to use us to rat on each other, just as they've been saying since the very beginning. If for anyone who thinks that this stuff is any type of conspiracy theory or anything like that, this comes from the actual government documents. If anyone would just take the time to actually pay attention and actually do the research and trust the science and trust the experts from the official government sources, they will tell you that they are using media and using these reports to get the governments of the world to act in lockstep to get you to increase the sense of your personal threat to your well-being. A key anchor points to the extensive scientific literature that establishes that wearing surgical masks and N95 respirators does not reduce the risk of contracting a verified illness. Jacobs et al. 2009 finds that use of surgical face masks to reduce the incidence of the common cold, which includes coronavirus, among healthcare workers in Japan, a randomized controlled trial, American Journal of Infection Control. N95 masked healthcare workers were significantly more likely to experience headaches, so of course these masks are not without significant consequences as well. Face mask use in healthcare workers was not demonstrated to provide benefit in terms of cold symptoms or contracting common colds, which again includes coronavirus respiratory viruses. Specifically, are surgical masks effective in stopping human transmission of coronaviruses? So this is an important study. I mean, so this is, I enjoy this study. And again, this is another one by Benjamin Cowling, main author of this study. And this is actually a good study. And respiratory virus shedding and exhaled breath and the efficacy of face masks. Both experimental and control groups, masked and unmasked respectively, were found to not shed detectable virus in respiratory droplets or aerosols. In that study, they did not confirm the infectivity of coronavirus, as found in exhaled breath. So even the unmasked control groups were not found to shed detectable virus in respiratory droplets or aerosols. In that study, they did not confirm the infectivity of coronavirus, as found in exhaled breath. And so what they did was they found that there was they detected coronavirus. So they tested the three different types of virus. They tested within a control group without masks and a group with face masks, and they tested for coronavirus, they tested for influenza, and they tested for rhinovirus. And it's interesting results because they detected coronavirus in both droplet particles and in aerosol particles without face masks, and they didn't detect any coronavirus particles in the samples with the face masks. Now, you don't just leave it there. It gets interest. There's a catch. There's a caveat to this, and it's interesting because they did detect particles with the face masks of influenza, especially in aerosols, but not so much in droplets. Although the mask did reduce particle detection in the droplets and in aerosols, measured by the graphs here. This is the amount of particles detected on this axis of the graph here. So they did reduce the particle detection. In rhinovirus, not so much. I mean, there was a slight reduction in the group wearing masks of their breath tested. Now, again, there's a catch to this. There's a catch, and in the discussion, they clarify this. The catch is that, you know, this, I'm not sure how they measured these particles, but I imagine that they measured this from the forward spray of breath, from breath coming directly forward through the mask. And I don't imagine that this tested for jets shooting out the side or the top or the bottom or behind the subject. So I imagine it only tested for the droplets or the aerosols sprayed through the transmission through the mask. Other main concern with the methodology of this study is they don't mention or disclose the exact method for how they collected the exhaled breath particle samples. They don't mention. So they mention that they collected it using the G2 collection device. But the collection distance, the distance from the subject's breath, I mean, we don't know how far away their collection sample was from the participant. How far away was it? I mean, so for example, I mean, they could have just placed it way too far away for it to even collect a viral particle sample. And so their discussion shows that our findings indicate that surgical masks can efficaciously reduce the emission of influenza particles into the environment through respiratory droplets, but not in aerosols. So that is incredibly important, and that shows mechanistically why all the highest outcome studies show that masks have no effect in reducing the amount of influenza viral transmissions or contraction of influenza virus in both clinical and community settings. So that's also why, and the main other reason why is also because of the air leakage out the sides and the top and the bottom of the masks. So they also demonstrated the efficacy of surgical masks to reduce coronavirus detection and viral copies in large respiratory droplets and in aerosols, as shown in Table B. This has important implications for control of COVID-19, suggesting that surgical face masks could be used by ill people to reduce onward transmission. So again, these are only demonstrable in actually symptomatic people. Yet again, asymptomatic spread, it has no implications for any of that for healthy people. But here's the catch, here's the caveat. Among the samples collected without a face mask, we found that the majority of participants with influenza and coronavirus infections did not shed detectable virus in respiratory droplets or aerosols. Whereas for rhinovirus, we detected virus in aerosols in 56% of participants. For coronavirus, 35% for influenza. So yet again, among the samples, the control essentially, collected samples without a face mask, they found that the majority of participants with influenza and coronavirus infection without a face mask did not shed detectable virus in respiratory droplets or in aerosols. So this means that even amongst symptomatic infected subjects, they didn't find shed detectable virus in respiratory droplets or in aerosols in the majority of people who were symptomatic and positively infected with both influenza and coronavirus. So that's huge implications. The majority of people, even if symptomatic and infected, for those who did shed virus in respiratory droplets and aerosols, the viral load in both tended to be low. In these samples, each exhaled breath collection was conducted for 30 minutes, which implies that prolonged contact would be required for any transmission to occur, even if transmission was primarily via aerosols and has been described for rhinovirus colds. Our results also indicate that there could be considerable heterogeneity in contagiousness of individuals with coronavirus and influenza virus infections. Heterogeneity means that there is a large variability in the contagiousness of individuals who were infected. The major limitation of this study was the large proportion of participants with undetectable viral shedding and exhaled breath for each of the viruses studied. We could have increased the sampling duration beyond 30 minutes to increase the viral shedding being captured at the cost of acceptability in some participants. However, the aim of the study was to simulate a real-life situation. So this shows that the large proportion of the participants, yet again, literally had undetectable viral shedding, even though they were positively infected with both influenza or coronavirus. So it just shows, even amongst symptomatic, the actual viral particle shedding is, I don't want to say very low, but the majority, the large proportion, had no detectable viral shedding, even in the infected symptomatic participants. Another limitation is that we did not confirm the infectivity of coronavirus or rhinovirus detected in exhaled breath. And in the present study, they were able to identify infectious influenza virus in aerosols, but they did not attempt to culture coronavirus or rhinovirus from the corresponding aerosol samples. So they don't know if it was even, infectious, if it was even able to be cultured from the few samples that did actually produce detectable viral shedding, which was very few and far between. Most did not detect any viral shedding whatsoever. All we want. But in the actual outcome studies, the highest quality studies, they show no effect, and they show not any infectivity from the exhaled breath, and not infectivity, no shed viral particles in respiratory droplets or aerosols. A study of aerosol penetration showed that the 2 of the 5 surgical masks studied had 51% to 89% penetration of polydisperse aerosols. Even so, they still said that the particle sample that they collected was very low and likely not even enough to be infectious whatsoever, even with, again, that's without the mask. Which essentially, the study that they're citing, this collection study here, which human subject evaluation, using salt aerosol to represent bacterial and viral particle size range, which is a garbage study. So, for example, they cite this garbage study. A previous study, a garbage study, reported that surgical masks and N95 masks were equally effective in preventing dissemination of influenza. This study is garbage, though, because they tested salt aerosols to represent bacterial and viral particle size range. And for example, this study here on the effectiveness of surgical and cotton masks in blocking SARS-CoV-2, a controlled comparison in merely only 4 patients in the Annals of Internal Medicine. The garbage methodology of this study is that when they collected samples from patients' mouths, they placed a petri dish approximately 20 centimeters from the patient's mouth and instructed them to cough 5 times onto a petri dish while wearing either no mask, a surgical mask, or a cotton mask, and again with no mask. And they placed it 20 centimeters from your mouth, which is basically literally almost inside your mouth, which is not a real world setting. It's not a real world sample. It's a garbage methodology. It's garbage. People aren't going to be coughing directly into each other's mouths at a distance of 20 centimeters. Literally, basically direct mouth-to-mouth contact. They're not going to be coughing directly into somebody else's mouth. That's not how you design a proper real-world methodology setting. It's garbage. But in the discussion, they reveal neither surgical nor cotton masks effectively filtered SARS-CoV-2 during coughs by infected patients. Prior evidence that surgical masks effectively filtered influenza virus, which they're citing this one study here, surgical and N95 to filter influenza patients with acute influenza, informed the recommendations that patients with confirmed or suspected COVID-19 should wear face masks to prevent transmission. However, the size and concentrations of SARS-CoV-2 in aerosols generated during coughing are unknown. Oberg and Brosso demonstrated that surgical masks did not exhibit adequate filter performance against aerosols measuring 0.9, 2.0, and 3.1 nanometers in diameter, approximately 0.08 to 0.1 nanometers, assuming that SARS-CoV-2 has SARS-CoV-2 is 0.1 micron, a nanometer in size. Surgical masks are unlikely, do not filter out the virus, even when the petri dish is placed literally almost inside your mouth. Of note, they also found greater contamination, again, on the outside of the mask than on the inner mask surface, meaning that all the viral particles are passing directly through the mask and collecting on the outside, where if your baby or anyone else or yourself touches the thing, it completely negates well, again, it's also shown that it is not surface transmitted by surfaces. We do not know whether masks shorten the travel distance of droplets during coughing. Further study is needed to recommend whether face masks decrease transmission of virus from asymptomatic individuals or those suspected with COVID-19 who are not coughing. In conclusion, both surgical and cotton masks seem to be ineffective in preventing the dissemination of SARS-CoV-2 from coughs of patients with COVID-19 to the environment and the external mask surface. Even though they did it place the petri dish directly almost inside the patient's mouths. Cowling B. et al. In 2010, face masks to prevent transmission of influenza virus A, a systematic review, epidemiology and infections. None of the studies reviewed show a benefit from wearing a mask in either healthcare workers or community members in households. See summary tables 1 and 2 therein. So these are the studies, 6 studies conducted in healthcare settings. A study of 446 nurses found no significant difference between N95 and surgical masks. 32 individuals followed for 77 days, and 133 healthcare workers found no significant differences between mask group and the control group. 133 healthcare workers found suboptimal use of standard precautions during high-risk procedures associated with higher risk of infection, of course. 250 medical personnel, no significant protective effect of face masks. 50 dental surgeons, no significant differences by mask use. Patients and staff, low case fatality rate could be associated with use of natural ventilation and gauze face masks. This was from the open-air hospitals back in 1918, where the patients that were treated in open air outdoors had significantly lower case fatality rates due to the fresh air, the sunlight, the beautiful singing of the birds, the animals, the nature, the green of the trees and everything, all known to produce beneficial positive immune boosting effects. And yet I had to delete this study from Patreon. They made me delete it for medical misinformation because they thought I was talking about COVID-19 when I was just simply posting the study on in 1918 influenza pandemic. But it's very powerful. Open air hospitals are incredible stuff. But of course you increase, obviously you don't want to be doing surgeries and stuff, but treating, influenza and infectious patients outdoors in the fresh air. I mean, it's the sunlight, the UV radiation from the sunlight kills bacteria or kills viruses. I mean, so it's significantly associated with low fatality rates from outdoor hospitals. Very interesting stuff. Studies in community settings. What have they found from this systematic review, a meta-analysis? Outpatients in Hong Kong, 322 index cases in their households found no significant difference overall. Significant difference between surgical masks plus hand hygiene and control if implemented within 36 hours of illness onset. So symptomatic illness patients, not healthy general public. We're talking symptomatic patients here. 122 index cases in their household context, no significant differences between surgical masks and the control group. 143 index cases in their household context, no significant difference overall, but significant difference between masks and the control group per protocol analysis. So there's one for masks. 1,437 university students. No significant differences overall, significant reductions in influenza-like illness during 4 to 6 weeks between masks plus hand hygiene versus control group and similar, but non-significant reductions between mask-only versus control groups. So there's possibly another one for in favor of mask usage. And in this meta-analysis, or the systematic review, in conclusion, there remains a substantial gap in the scientific literature on effectiveness of face masks to reduce transmission of influenza virus infection. While there is some experimental evidence that masks should be able to reduce infectiousness under controlled conditions, again, mechanistic and theoretical postulations, not actual outcomes and substantial significant findings, such as the Denmark randomized control trial conducted in 2020 found no significant difference between masks and control group. There is less evidence on whether this translates to effectiveness in natural settings. There is little evidence to support the effectiveness of face masks to reduce the risk of infection. The use of masks and respirators to prevent transmission of influenza, a systematic review of the scientific evidence, published in 2012. There were 17 eligible studies. Six of 8 randomized control trials found no significant differences between control and intervention groups, which included masks, with or without hand hygiene, and N95 respirators. None of the studies established a conclusive relationship between mask, respirator use, and protection against influenza infection. A systematic review and meta-analysis, which these are all literally the highest tiers on the hierarchy of evidence. You can't beat these studies here. These are actual studies. They're reviewing the totality of all the data out there. These are not mechanistic theoretical studies done on mannequins or on animals or on any of that garbage that they're trying to foist upon us in the year 2020. These are decades of systematic reviews and meta-analyses of randomized controlled trials. It finds none of... There were 17 eligible studies. None of these studies established a conclusive relationship between mask, respirator use, and protection against influenza infection. Furthermore, we do not have an adequate understanding of the number, size, and dispersion of the droplets that contain live infectious particles produced by infected patients. A laboratory-based study reported data that humans infected with influenza rarely produce aerosols that contain infectious viral particles. In 2 other laboratory studies, participants infected with influenza produced droplets containing viral RNA, but viral RNA could not be detected on a mannequin head forms or on filters of breathing mannequins at distances as close to 1 meter following participants breathing, counting, coughing, or laughing. So even breathing, counting, coughing, or laughing on these mannequins within a meter of distance, they found no influenza droplets containing viral RNA on those mannequins within a close proximity, directly breathing, coughing, and laughing on them. The study in 2017. This systematic review and meta-analysis, effectiveness of masks and respirators against respiratory infections in healthcare workers, published in Oxford Clinical Infectious Diseases, analysis of randomized controlled trials indicated a protective effect of masks and respirators against clinical respiratory illness with a risk ratio of 0.59 and influenza-like illness, a risk ratio of 0.34, and compared to masks, N95 had conferred superior protection against clinical respiratory illness with a risk ratio of 0.47 and laboratory confirmed bacterial at a risk of 0.46, but not viral infections or influenza-like illness. Meta-analysis of observational studies provided evidence of a protective effect of masks and respirators against severe acute respiratory syndrome, or SARS. This systematic review and meta-analysis supports the use of respiratory protection. However, the existing evidence is sparse and findings are inconsistent within and across studies. But here's the catch with this meta-analysis and systematic review. Here's the catch. Continuous respiratory personal PPE use versus no respiratory PPE. So in other words, wearing masks and PPE versus no masks and PPE. Here's the catch. Wearing a medical mask and N95 respirator throughout the work shift conferred significant protection against self-reported clinical respiratory illness. So here's the catch. It was self-reported, which is highly prone to bias. So all these results were self-reported, highly prone to bias. And here's the other main catch, the main takeaway from this meta-analysis and systematic review. Meta-analysis suggested a protective, but not statistically significant effect against laboratory-confirmed viral infections, as per figure 2. So there's the catch there. You wouldn't have caught that from just reading the abstract. These results were self-reported, and although it suggested a protective effect, it was not statistically significant. Self-reported assessment of clinical outcomes was prone to bias. A total of 6 randomized controlled trials involving 9,000 participants were included. There were no statistically significant differences in preventing laboratory-confirmed influenza, laboratory-confirmed respiratory viral infections, laboratory-confirmed respiratory infection, and influenza-like illness using N95 respirators and surgical masks. Meta-analysis indicated a protective effect of N95 respirators against laboratory-confirmed bacterial colonization. The use of N95 respirators compared with surgical masks is not associated with a lower risk of laboratory-confirmed influenza, because again, neither one of these are associated with a lower risk of laboratory-confirmed influenza either. Conclusion regarding that masks do not work. No randomized control study with verified outcome shows a benefit for healthcare workers or community members in households to wearing a mask or a respirator. There is no such study, except for now we have the Denmark study, which does show that there is no significance showing a benefit of outcomes at preventing respiratory viral infections. The Denmark randomized control trial study did show that there was no effect at preventing transmissions. Likewise, no study exists that shows a benefit from a broad policy to wear masks in public. Furthermore, if there were any benefit to wearing a mask because of the blocking power against droplets and aerosol particles, then there should be more benefit from wearing a respirator compared to a surgical mask, because the respirator blocks more droplets than the surgical mask does. Yet every large meta-analysis and systematic review of meta-analysis of randomized control trials, and all the randomized control trials prove that there is no such relative benefit. So if we're going on the mechanistic theory that's out there of 2020 that, oh, if you block more respiratory droplets, you're going to stop more infections from happening, in theory, or on animals, or tests on mannequins, or on animals, or breathing humidity into a box, then that would show that surgical masks should have a far less effect of N95 respirators, and there is no difference between the two. Masks and respirators do not work. I'm sorry, that's just not the way it works. You have to go by the highest quality of evidence, the highest tier of evidence here. So this report, this paper is published by Colleen Huber, A Summary of the Science. A review of the peer-reviewed medical literature examines impacts on human health, both immunological as well as physiological. The purpose of this paper is to examine data regarding the effectiveness of face masks as well as safety data. The reason that both are examined in one paper is that for the general public as a whole, as well as for every individual, a risk-to-benefit analysis is necessary to guide decisions on if and when to wear a mask. So this is a preprint, meaning it has not yet been peer-reviewed as of April 7th, 2020. I'm not sure about if it has passed peer review by now, but this is a 2020 brand new study from back in April 2020. Physical interventions to interrupt or reduce the spread of respiratory viruses. Part 1: face mask, eye protection, and social distancing. A systematic review and meta-analysis. The results: we included 15 randomized trials on the effect of investigating the effect of masks in healthcare workers and in the general population, and of quarantine. Compared to no masks, there was no risk. There was no reduction of influenza-like illness cases or influenza for masks in the general population, nor in healthcare workers. There was no difference between surgical masks and N95 respirators for influenza-like illness. For influenza, harms were poorly reported and limited to discomfort with lower compliance. The only trial testing quarantining workers with household influenza-like illness contacts found a reduction in influenza-like illness cases, but increased risk of quarantined workers contracting influenza. So this is exactly what all the other studies have been showing, is that quarantining and locking people down increases infections, familial cluster infections. Conclusions. Most included trials had poor design, reporting, and sparse events. There was insufficient evidence to provide a recommendation on the use of facial barriers without other measures. We found insufficient evidence for a difference between surgical masks and N95 respirators, and limited evidence to support effectiveness of quarantine. Based on observational evidence from the previous SARS epidemic, included in the previous version of our Cochrane review, we do recommend the use of face masks combined with other measures. So they're recommending face masks combined with these other measures but they're admitting that they found insufficient evidence. And they're also admitting that the increased risk of contracting infections from being quarantined. Just as all the other studies also show that locking down and quarantining people in their homes actually increases the risk, the rates of infections. Familial cluster infections and other types of infections as well. Nosocomial infections contracted in hospital and healthcare settings as well as nursing homes. This 2020 meta-analysis, and again, this is the one I think that I showed you already, found that evidence from randomized control trials of face masks did not support a substantial effect on transmission of laboratory-confirmed influenza, either worn by infected persons as source control or by persons in the general community to reduce their susceptibility. Another recent review, systematic review, these are the highest tier, the highest absolute quality of evidence that can possibly be conducted, found that masks had no effect specifically against COVID-19, although face mask use seemed linked to, in 3 of 31 studies, very slightly reduced odds of developing influenza-like illness. So in 3 of 31 studies, it seemed linked to very slightly reduced odds of developing influenza-like illness, but not specifically against COVID-19. This 2016 meta-analysis found that both randomized control trials and observational studies found that N95 respirators and surgical masks used by healthcare workers did not show benefit against transmission of acute respiratory infections. It was also found that acute respiratory infection transmission may have occurred via contamination of provided respiratory protective equipment during storage and reuse of masks and respirators throughout the workday. A 2011 meta-analysis of 17 studies regarding masks and effect on transmission of influenza found that none of the studies established a conclusive relationship between masks, respirator use, and protection against influenza infection. However, authors speculated that effectiveness of masks may be linked to early, consistent, and correct usage. But that's speculation, so therefore it can be completely thrown out, essentially. Face mask use was likewise found to be not protective against the common cold, which is a coronavirus, compared to controls without face masks among healthcare workers. Airflow around the masks. Masks have been assumed to be effective in obstructing forward travel of viral particles. Considering those positioned next to or behind a mask wearer, there have been farther transmission of virus-laden fluid particles from masked individuals than from unmasked individuals, by means of several leakage jets, including intense backward and downward jets that may present major hazards, even if taped to your face while wearing 5 masks, as we discussed earlier, and a potentially dangerous leakage jet of up to several meters. So it doesn't block the transmission of the airflow, it just increases the air pressure of the airflow through the small leakages that occur. All masks were thought to reduce forward airflow by 90% or moreover wearing no mask. However, imaging showed that both surgical masks and cloth masks had farther brow jets, in other words, upward airflow past eyebrows, than not wearing any mask at all. 182 millimeter and 203 millimeter respectively versus none discernible with no mask. Backward unfiltered airflow was found to be strong with all masks compared to not masking. So you're blocking people in front of you from getting your air spray, but the people behind you and beside you are getting strong jets of airflow. For both N95 and surgical masks, it was found that expelled particles from 0.03 to 1 micron size were deflected around the edges of each mask, and there were measurable penetration of particles through the filter of each mask. And these are N95 and surgical masks. Penetration through masks. A study of 44 mask brands found 35% penetration. Most medical masks had over 20% penetration, while general masks and handkerchiefs had no protective function in terms of aerosol filtration efficiency. The study found that medical masks, general masks, and handkerchiefs, in other words cloth masks, were found to provide little protection against respiratory aerosols. It may be helpful to remember that an aerosol is a colloidal suspension of liquid or solid particles in a gas. In respiration, the relevant aerosol is the suspension of bacterial or viral particles inhaled or exhaled breath. In another study, penetration of cloth masks by particles was almost 97%, and medical masks by 47%. In other words, cloth masks are ineffective almost entirely. And again, as we discussed earlier, even if layered together with 5 masks, even when taped to your face. N95 respirators. Honeywell is the manufacturer of N95 respirators. These are made with a 0.3 micron filter. N95 respirators are named because the 95% of particles having a diameter of 0.3 microns are filtered by the masks forward of the wearer by use of an electrostatic mechanism. Coronaviruses are approximately 0.1 microns in diameter. So in other words, they pass right through the N95 respirators, which only have a 0.3 micron filter. So sorry folks, coronaviruses are still way too small to be blocked by an N95 respirator. This meta-analysis found that N95 respirators did not provide superior protection to face masks against viral infections or influenza-like. This study did find superior protection by N95 respirators when they were fit tested compared to surgical masks. Okay, so there's one meta-analysis out of all the other meta-analysis which found, and the randomized controlled trials which found that there was no difference. But the meta-analysis is the highest quality of evidence, so it reviews multiple studies. This study found that 624 out of 714 people wearing N95 masks left visible gaps when putting on their own masks. So in other words, you have to have a medical professional fit testing your mask every time you wear it, in order to not have any visible gaps. And again, even if you tape it to your face and you wear 5 of them, it has no difference. Surgical masks. This study found that surgical masks offered no protection at all against influenza. Another study found that surgical masks had about 85% penetration ratio of aerosolized inactivated influenza particles at about 95% of Staphylococcus aureus bacteria, although Staph aureus bacterial particles were about 6 times the diameter of influenza particles. Use of masks in surgery were found to slightly increase incidence of infection over not masking in a study of 3,000 surgeries. The surgeon's masks were found to give no protective effect to the patients. So in other words, even though surgeons wear masks which is only to prevent, as discussed in the .gov.uk paper that I discussed earlier, surgeons wear masks to prevent blood and bodily fluids from splashing onto the surgeon, or from preventing spit or droplets from getting inside the patient. It's not to prevent any type of respiratory or viral infections spread via droplets, because they don't work in doing so. Other studies found no difference in wound infection rates with and without surgical masks. So in other words, even with the surgical masks, they found no difference between the infection rates of wearing them to not wearing them. This study found that there is a lack of substantial evidence to support the claims that face masks protect either patient or surgeon from infectious contamination. Hospital infection, surgical face masks in modern operating rooms, a costly and unnecessary ritual. Published in 1991. Oral microbial flora dispersed by unmasked male and female agender volunteers standing 1 meter from the table failed to contaminate exposed settle plates placed on the table. The wearing of face masks by non-scrubbed staff working in an operating room with forced ventilation seems to be unnecessary. A unnecessary and a costly surgical mask operating room ritual. This study found that medical masks have a wide range of filtration efficiency, with most showing a 30% to 50% efficiency, which means that there's still a large amount of transmission passing through the masks. Cloth masks. Cloth masks were found to have low efficiency for blocking particles of 0.3 microns and smaller. And again, SARS-CoV-2 is 0.1 micron. Aerosol penetration through the various cloth masks examined in the study were between 74 and 90%. Likewise, the filtration efficiency of fabric materials was 3% to 33%, respectively. Healthcare workers wearing cloth masks were found to have 13 times more risk of influenza-like illness than those wearing medical masks. This 1920 analysis of cloth masks during the 1918 pandemic examines the failure of masks to impede or stop influenza transmission at that time, and concluded that the number of layers of fabric required to prevent pathogen penetration would have required a suffocating number of layers, and could not be used for that reason because the patient would suffocate to death, even if taped to your face while wearing 5 masks, as well as the problem of leakage of the vents around the edges of the cloth masks. We've known this since 1920, since the Masks Against COVID-19. The New England Journal of Medicine editorial on the topic of mask use versus COVID-19 assesses the matter as follows. We know that wearing a mask outside healthcare facilities offers little, if any, protection from infection. Public health authorities define a significant exposure to COVID-19 as face-to-face contact within 6 feet with a patient with symptomatic COVID-19, of direct face-to-face contact with someone who is symptomatically coughing or sneezing or breathing right into your face, and only after 20 or 10 minutes. The chance of catching COVID-19 from a passing interaction in a public space is therefore minimal. In many cases, the desire for widespread masking is merely a reflexive emotional reaction to the fear and anxiety about the pandemic, which is being caused and stirred up and rubbed in your face by the media and the news, trying to scare the piss out of you.
It's tricky. It's not safe to get together, to travel, to be in person with other people indoors with folks that are...
Actually, yes, it is safe, lady. Are you going to provide people with the actual stratified, granulated statistical data of the case fatality rate and more importantly, the infection fatality rate, which is median range of 0.2% as proposed by, as published by professors of epidemiology at Stanford, John Ioannidis' studies, now finally published and accepted by the World Health Organization, published by the World Health Organization as well, whereas they spent the past 7 months trying to delete and ban him from YouTube and from Twitter and from social media, and trying to demonize him and trying to villainize him, and now they're actually forced to have to actually publish his data, which was right all along the entire time. And yet everyone villainized him because it went against the World Health Organization, and now they're publishing his data because he is the top scientist in the world.
In your immediate household, if you are planning to see others, everyone should quarantine for 14 days, tested.
Without question that the WHO in October 2019 were entirely correct based on 100 years of science, right, and research. You don't quarantine exposed individuals when a virus is out and about in a community. That's only for island nations very early on, when you've got a couple of people maybe coming in and you stop them bringing the virus into the country. But you certainly don't lock down populations. So WHO 19.
Tested, indoor gatherings, even with people that you know and that you love.
That she is reading without citing any facts, without showing any statistical data. She's not citing her sources. She is not fact-checking her sources. She is not showing you any empirical evidence for you to decide for yourself what your risk is. What your risk and what the danger is to you. She's not telling you what your risk is, which is for 70 and older, it dramatically rises. The risk rises to 7 to 8%, up to as much as 20 to 30% in certain cases. For nursing homes, COVID is a disease of the nursing homes, and it mostly only affects people in nursing homes who are literally going to die this year within months of their infection anyways. They are already on the verge of death, and that's what the actual statistical granulated data, when you show who is in the hospital, who are these patients in the hospital, who are these patients on ventilators, what is their weight, why do they all have diabetes, heart disease, cancer, dozens of comorbidities, and why are they already in such poor health that COVID just simply acts as a catalyst and pushes them over the edge, from which they were already going to fall off anyways. In fact, for the vast majority of the population, including those 70 years and older, is actually, well, I mean, unless for nursing home with high severe comorbidities, for the vast majority of the population in all age groups, as I've shown you throughout the excess mortality data from all age groups, it's low overall. In fact, it's far lower than seasonal influenza for all age groups except for very old and very moribund. In other words, very sick and very ill elderly patients who are already going to die anyways from all-cause mortality, because the actual mortality rate of COVID-19 is lower than the all-cause mortality rate. So that means you're more likely to die from all causes aside from COVID-19. That means the COVID-19 mortality rate is lower than normal all-cause rate. Right here, produced by an awesome friend, Ethical Skeptic on Twitter, who does great work. He uses this handle, Ethical Skeptic. He's got an amazing website, and he is one of the most intelligent and absolutely competent and qualified professionals in his field that I have ever seen, but he uses the pseudonym Ethical Skeptic in order to protect his identity and his career. But he cites the Florida Department of Health open data on this data set here for COVID-19, compares it to the U.S. Social Security Administration Actuarial Life Table risk of death by age, and compares and shows that the Florida COVID-19 case fatality risk by age is actually lower than the normal risk of fatality by age, meaning that you're more likely to die of normal causes even if COVID-19 had never even existed. So your normal risk of all-cause mortality by age is higher than the COVID-19 risk by age. That means you would already die of all causes aside from COVID-19. That means COVID-19 is literally not even impactful compared to the all-cause mortality rate. The COVID-19 mortality rate is lower than all-cause mortality rate. And for all age groups, especially for the young, it's literally 0.0000000%. It is almost negligible. The need to have a national coordinated response remains, but this is being met by government's COVID-19 response. Cases of COVID-19 are no longer managed by the high-consequence infectious disease treatment centers. All healthcare workers managing possible and confirmed cases should follow the updated guidance for COVID-19, which supersedes all previous guidance for COVID-19. This guidance includes instructions about different personal protective equipment. In the UK, the definition of a high-consequence infectious disease is defined according to the following criteria. Acute infectious disease typically has a high case fatality rate, which COVID-19 does not. May not have effective prophylaxis or treatment. Okay, so there you have it. The UK government is confirming that COVID-19 has effective prophylaxis and treatment for it, such as hydroxychloroquine, or they're promoting remdesivir. That's fine, promote whatever you want, but these are effective prophylaxis and treatments, as well as often difficult to recognize and detect rapidly. So that means COVID-19 is easy to recognize and detect rapidly. Ability to spread in the community and within healthcare settings is high, but maybe it just doesn't meet all the rest of these criteria. Requires enhanced individual, population, and system response to ensure it's managed effectively, efficiently, and safely. So that means if COVID-19 is no longer considered a high-consequence infectious disease, that means that it's not required to enhance individual, population, and system response to ensure it's managed effectively, efficiently, and safety. That means we don't have to do any of these measures by the government of UK's own definition of high consequence infectious disease. That means they're saying we don't have to utilize all of these measures that we're using to manage it effectively, efficiently, and safety, because it doesn't matter, because it's so low overall mortality rate that it literally does not matter. That's the government saying this. They can't hide this from you. They're trying to hide this from you. But here it is. They're trying to keep this from you. They don't want you to know this. that you don't have to do population system response in order to ensure that it's managed effectively, efficiently, and safely, because it doesn't freaking matter. That's how inconsequential this condition is. The classification of high consequence infectious diseases are further divided into contact and airborne groups. Contact high consequence infectious diseases are usually spread by direct contact with an infected patient or infected fluids, tissues, and other materials, or by indirect contact with contaminated materials and fomites. We now know conclusively, through all the peer-reviewed published medical data, that COVID-19 is not transmitted by surface transmission. It's not a means of transmission. We know that. It's published in the peer-reviewed medical science literature. Airborne high-consequence infectious diseases are spread by respiratory droplets or aerosol transmission, in addition to contact routes of transmission. And COVID-19 has no contact routes of transmission. That's published in the peer-reviewed medical literature. That's why it's not classified as a high-consequence infectious disease, because if it was transferred through contact, then it would meet this criteria, but it doesn't. That's why it's not. List of high-consequence infectious diseases by Public Health England and NHS. Protect the NHS. These are actual high-consequence infectious diseases. Argentine hemorrhagic fever, Andes virus infection, Bolivian hemorrhagic fever, avian flu. So, bird flu is a high-consequence infectious disease. Bird flu H7N7, Ebola, Congo hemorrhagic fever, Lassa fever, Lujo virus disease, Marburg virus disease, severe fever with thrombocytopenia syndrome, severe acute respiratory SARS. The actual SARS is considered the original SARS because it had a super high mortality rate of 30%, but it was so ineffectively transmitted. That's why it wasn't a super huge pandemic spreading disease, because it was super high death rate, but it was very hard to spread amongst a huge population. That's why it didn't spread very far and didn't end up killing a whole lot of people. It's extremely deadly, but it wasn't as transmissible as a super let's just leave it at that. Pneumonia or pneumonic plague, Nipah virus infection, monkeypox, MERS. SARS and MERS are super 30% mortality rate, and MERS is a 50% mortality rate. No cases reported since 2004, but SARS remains a notifiable disease under. So, the actual SARS is a real high consequence infectious disease. COVID-19 is not one of them. They can't trick you into they're trying to, but you can't be fooled because they're trying to hide the actual data from you, and now you know. And you have to confront them with the actual data. You have to bring this up. You have to challenge them by showing them their own data. They're trying to hide this from you. They don't want you to know the actual truth. They don't want you to know the real science. Instead, they're relying on you to trust the news and trying to pretend like the news are experts, and they're not. And they're paying off scientists to deceive you. And you know that because they're not showing you any actual real data. If it's a whole other story if they want to go on the news and they want to actually show you a full comprehensive science data presentation like this film that I'm showing you. If they go on the news and show you all this data, that's fine. Then they can be considered, honest, intellectual experts. But if they're not showing you any actual data on the news, they're not taking the time out. No government officials are holding conferences to inform the public about the actual raw data. Links to relevant Public Health England guidance for healthcare professionals. Avian flu, MERS, monkeypox, the plague, these are real high consequence infectious diseases. COVID-19 is not one of these. It's not listed. COVID-19 is not listed in any of these high consequence infectious diseases. COVID-19 is not one. It's not one of them. It's literally in the ballpark of seasonal influenza, as I've shown in all the peer-reviewed published data proves that. Anyone that says otherwise, any fact checkers, Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, any of these other tech corporations trying to sell you product and services, they can't debunk this. They're just trying to hide it from you. They can't debunk it. You have to show them, you have to challenge them, you have to press them very hard, show them the actual data, and watch them squirm. And only recommended at all times for symptomatic individuals, not for the general population. Whereas, yet again, we go even further for the recommendations on the use of non-pharmaceutical interventions by the severity level. And again, based upon severity level, during any pandemic, face masks are only recommended for symptomatic individuals, as well as the isolation or the quarantine only of sick individuals. We would never isolate the healthy or even the exposed individuals, ever, based upon the citations found right down here, not recommended under any circumstances. Based on the contact tracing, never recommended under any circumstances by the World Health Organization 2019 guidelines. Never recommended under any circumstances are the quarantine of exposed individuals to be isolated. Never are we supposed to recommend under any circumstances the entry and exit screening of individuals. Never are we to recommend the border closures under any circumstances based on the World Health Organization 2019 guidelines. And only during a high severity consequence do we recommend face masks for the general population. And again, COVID-19 is not a high severity pandemic and is not a high consequence infectious disease as per gov.uk. And only under extraordinary severity, which would be a category 4 or a category 5 pandemic, would we recommend workplace closures and measures due to the severe consequences and detrimental effects to the general population, creating vast poverty and economic destruction. Only under a category 5, under extraordinary pandemic circumstances, would we recommend workplace measures and closures. We would never recommend workplace closures and measures due to the severe impact of society. Prove something about the use of face masks from the latest update. This is the most recent update, again from Public Health England, NHS, COVID-19 guidance for maintaining services within healthcare settings. So let me show you exactly how they're trying to manipulate you, not based on the actual real evidence here. Let me show you let me show you what they actually say. They say on the use of face masks, the use of face masks or face coverings, number 2 reference here. This number 2 reference is important because you have to follow all the references back to the original evidence and evidence-based sources. So the use of face masks or face coverings, superscript number 2, across the UK is recommended in addition to social distancing and hygiene for staff, patients and individuals and visitors in both clinical and non-clinical areas to reduce risk of transmission. Okay, so this use of non-clinical areas and individuals and visitors, so that's what is supposed to qualify as basically the general public and everybody who is not sick, which goes directly against the World Health Organization guidelines, which say only sick people. That face masks should only be worn by asymptomatic under conditionally recommended circumstances and only under severe epidemics or pandemics to reduce the transmission in the community. And although these recommendations are based on zero evidence that this is indeed effective in reducing transmission, are required to wear face masks. And again, World Health Organization says only sick people. And so they're trying to make it to where everybody has to wear these, but it doesn't say everybody has to. It says it's recommended. And they try to to lump it in as the general population, the general public has to if they're not sick. They try to. And their reference for trying to do that is superscript 2. So let's see what superscript 2 reads. Each UK country has recommended that the general public must wear a face mask covering. So these are direct contradictory terms here. They're using recommended and then they're saying must. You must wear it if it's recommended. You must because it's recommended. Recommended is not a mandate. It's a guidance. It's a suggestion. Okay, these two words, must wear a face covering by law. And here's the real kicker here. They try to make you think that this is by law, that it's a lawful, that it's an actual law that has passed through legislation. It's not. That's why they're not citing. See, they cite a superscript here for the claim made up there, but they're not citing a superscript or a subscript for this claim here that it's covering by law. Because there is no law, there's no legislation. They can't actually pass a legislation that demands that the general public has to wear it at all times. That's why it's only a recommended that must wear a face covering by law. There's no reference here that claims that there is an actual law that has passed through legislation that demands that mandates this. In some public places, unless exempt from wearing a face covering due to age, health, or other condition. Each country also has guidance for face masks, face coverings when working outside the clinical area in health and social care settings. Okay, so let's go further. It goes a little bit further. And they try to justify it yet again by saying the IPC measured. Okay, so, whoops. Oh, damn it. Lost my place. All right. So the IPC principles, which is infectious prevention care or infection prevention measures in this document apply to all health and care settings, including acute diagnostic. So this is talking about in actual care homes, care at home. This is for actual sick people. We're talking about in a healthcare setting, actually sick people. That falls in guidance with the World Health Organization. Sick people wear masks, not the general healthy asymptomatic public do not wear masks. This is for healthcare settings and for caring for sick people. So, the IPC measures recommended are underpinned by National Infection Prevention. Okay, so IPC is Infection Prevention Control Manual Practice Guide. So we will go through what the IPC Control Manual actually says regarding face masks for the general population. Each country has recommended that, again, we've already read that, so let's go further to what they say. They say, the guidance is issued jointly by the Department of Health and Social Care, Public Health Wales, Public Health Agency Northern Ireland, Health Protection Scotland, National Services Scotland, Public Health England, NHS England, for healthcare organizations. The content is consistent. They claim here that the content is consistent with the administrative measures outlined in the World Health Organization Infection Prevention Control during healthcare when coronavirus is suspected or confirmed. Okay, so it says the IPC measures recommended are underpinned by National Infection Prevention and Control Manual, Practice Guide, and associate literature reviews. Okay, so that's a nice claim. Let's follow their cited reference here to support that claim and see if it actually does, indeed. So let's see the National Infection Prevention Control Manual, if it actually does, regarding face masks. So there's nothing here on the main page. Let's read through all their index here of where they try to cite that face masks for the general public is in any way required or in any way recommended. Let's see if they, if the sources that they're citing from .gov.uk actually has any evidence and basis behind it and backing it up based on cited references and based on any actual real evidence. So that would be so in chapter 1 it says nothing. These are hand hygiene. This is all for medical controls professionals. So this is talking about in hospitals, in healthcare settings, for caring for sick patients, caring for sick people. That's where they recommend PPE, personal protective equipment. So these are for healthcare professionals: gloves, double gloving, aprons, Eye and face protection must be worn if blood or bodily fluids contamination to the eyes is anticipated likely during aerosol-generating procedures. Blood or any bodily fluid contamination to the eyes is likely. Be worn on all scrubbed members, surgical team members. So this is for healthcare professionals in hospitals, in healthcare settings, caring for sick people. Fluid-resistant surgical face masks must be worn if splashing. So this is for masks worn if splashing or spraying of blood, bodily fluids, secretions, or excretion onto respiratory mucosa is anticipated or likely. Full face visors worn in combination with a face shield or goggles on AGPs on non-infectious patients. Worn to protect patients from operator source of infection when performing invasive spinal procedures. So they're talking about when blood and bodily fluid secretions are going to splash on a healthcare professional, on a doctor, on someone performing surgical procedures, when surgical team members are in a surgical theater, to prevent exposure to blood or bodily fluids splashing in their face, nose, eyes, and mouth directly at a face-to-face contact area here. In a healthcare setting, it says nothing about general public population. Okay, so let's go to, that's chapter 1. That's what chapter 1 says. Spilling of bodily fluids. This is for health care settings. This is for healthcare settings, clinical settings. It's for clinical settings. Okay, so let's go back. Let's check chapter 2, transmission-based precautions. This is where they would presumably be making these claims that the general healthy population has to wear face masks based on evidence. There is no evidence, and the World Health Organization confirms this, that the general healthy population is not to wear, does not have to wear face masks. You can do it if you want to. If you want to, I encourage that. If you want to, I encourage that. I encourage you to also go by the evidence and not make false claims saying that everybody has to at all costs, or else you get fined and you go to jail, because there's no evidence to suggest that it even works. There's no evidence to suggest that it's even effective from the World Health Organization 2019 guidelines. Okay, so required use by staff when caring for patients with a known or suspected infection or colonization. There you have it. Worn by healthcare staff when caring for patients. This is for clinical healthcare professionals when caring for sick patients or suspected infection. Suspected or known infected agents. Clinical judgment decisions should be made by clinical healthcare staff on the necessary precautions. This must be based on the severity of illness caused. That means sick people. Severely sick people. Transmission route of infection agent, healthcare setting and procedures undertaken, transmission of infectious agents, contact precautions used to prevent and control infections that spread via direct contact with patient or indirectly through immediate care environment, including care equipment. This is the most common route of cross-infection transmission. Actually, not for COVID-19, does not transmit through contact surfaces. We now know that based on all the highest quality studies that have come out that show surfaces are not the pathway of transmission for COVID-19. That's not a insubstantial claim. That's what all the studies actually say. Okay, so but again, I recommend you guys to wear a face mask if it makes you feel better, and if you want to do that, please do that. I recommend that you please do that, but it's not recommended that everybody has to, especially if you're not sick. The World Health Organization only recommended it for sick people in 2019 guidelines. The newest evidence that's come out in 2020, the highest quality studies, do not overturn that 2019 guidelines. Droplet precautions, airborne precautions, control infections spread without necessarily having close patient contact via aerosols from the respiratory tract of one individual directly onto a mucosal surface or conjunctive of another individual. So in other words, directly into someone's face or nose or eyes or mouth. Patient placement, assessment for risk infection. Hospital settings, patients who may present across infection risks. So we're talking still about in healthcare, hospital healthcare settings for sick patients. I'm not seeing anything here regarding general public or general, especially not outdoors, especially not outdoors, especially not for healthy people outdoors, hiking a trail, exercising outside, outdoor gyms, anything outdoor. Nothing here about outdoors for the general public, general population. These are all in direct close quarters healthcare, hospital care, healthcare patients, healthcare facilities for sick patients. Okay, PPE, personal protective equipment, surgical masks. A type IIR fluid-resistant surgical mask must be worn when caring for a patient with a suspected/confirmed infected agent spread by droplet route. Surgical masks worn by patients with suspected or confirmed infected agents spread by droplet airborne routes as a form of source control should meet Type 2 IIR standards. The general public is not meeting Type 2 IIR standards. It's not. This is not for the general public, especially not outdoors. It's not, and especially not for healthy people. Eye face protection. A face visor goggles should be used in combination with the Type 2 IIR surgical mask. This is not for the general public, general population, especially not outdoors for healthy people. The face visor goggles should be used in combination with fluid-resistant FFP3 respirator when caring for symptomatic patients infected. That's confirmed infection for actually sick symptomatic patients in hospital care settings. This is not for the general public, general population, healthy population, especially not outdoors. Eye face protection should be worn by all those in the room when potentially infectious agents, AGP, are conducted for the care of patients with novel infectious agents, including in pandemic influenza. These are still all in healthcare settings for infected patients, for visibly symptomatic and sick patients in healthcare. It's not for the general public, general population. So it goes on, staff in hospital, medical receiving, surgical, midwifery, specialty wards, ambulance transport staff. That makes sense. These people are actually caring for clinical patients. You know, this is not general population. This is not general public. Okay? It doesn't work if you have mutton chops, long mustache, if you have any facial hair. Well, it works for a goatee. It could work for a goatee or a handlebar. This means you have to adjust your personal facial. So this is the only facial styles that you can have for your face masks to work. Nobody with a handlebar, with a long mustache, their mask is not working. Nobody with mutton chops is effective at preventing transmission. Nobody with extended goatee effective at transmission. Nobody with even stubble is effective with an FFP3 respirator. This is not just like cloth masks. This is the most high quality medical healthcare PPE that medicine can buy. And even having facial stubble, it doesn't work. It's not recommended. It's only recommended for a flavor saver, for a pencil thin mustache, for a thick mustache, but a clean chin, and for a handlebar mustache with a clean chin, and for a goatee with a clean chin. You can't have stubble and expect the most high quality medical equipment to work in a medical setting. It doesn't work. So this is the guidelines for required fitting and checking of respirators found on the health and safety website. Absence of, outside the isolation cohort room area. All other PPE should be removed in patient care area. Powered hoods, respirator and powered hoods. Infection prevention and control during health care of the deceased. And that's it. There you have it, folks. That's it. That is the entirety of the transmission-based precautions from the National Infection Prevention and Control Manual from the National Services of Scotland. That's the cited source. That's the cited evidence that they're citing for the claims that they're making that the general public and general population of healthy people outdoors must also again, must wear a face covering by law in some public places, unless exempt. And this unless exempt, it means, let's see, if it can be tolerated. Let's see where it says if tolerated. It says if tolerated. This means only people who can actually genuinely not everybody can tolerate wearing a face mask. So that's the evidence that they cited. The use of face masks, face coverings, superscript 2, across UK, for individuals and visitors in both clinical and non-clinical areas. So they try to make this apply to the general healthy population, especially outdoors, but the actual evidence from the official control manuals do not say anything about outdoors for healthy people. It's only for indoor healthcare settings that the actual control measures guidelines actually say any of that. Uncontrolled if printed. Okay, so let's see where they say also if tolerated. Where did I find that one? Oh, here it goes. Number 2. The use of face masks for staff and patients, quote, is if tolerated, is required across all care pathways in the UK. That is healthcare settings. In both clinical, well, it says in non-clinical areas. So this is where it tries to apply to the general population. But that's only if tolerated. And again, the actual IPC control manual says nothing about non-clinical areas. The IPC control manual does not support this statement here. This is only .gov.uk. This is only the government. In other words, the political. This is only political that says non-clinical areas. That is not this is not the science that is saying this here in non-clinical areas. Sessional or extended use should be limited to care areas where healthcare workers are providing continuous care for a group or cohort suspected or confirmed patients. In other words, healthcare settings, healthcare workers for sick patients, confirmed or suspected. Good reasonable suspicion would be they're actually sick and they have all the actual symptoms that would indeed concur with a confirmed patient. So although they're saying in non-clinical areas, if tolerated, this means that not everybody has to do it, okay? So I know the police in the UK and other countries are going out trying to enforce, these things as if they're passed by law, but in this document, they did not cite any law. They did not cite any actual published legislative law that supports that statement. There is no law that they're citing here. These are recommendations. Healthcare settings. So these are the care pathways that they were citing earlier on. Care pathway, high risk, medium risk, low risk care pathways are any care facility. These pathways have nothing to do with the general public, such as businesses, outdoor areas like restaurants, has nothing to do with outside at a park, hiking a trail, outdoors, camping, out on the beach, surfing in the ocean, paddle boarding. This has nothing to do. These are all in care facilities. Are all of these pathways healthcare pathways? So here is medium risk and low risk care pathways. Planned elective surgical procedures, oncology, chemotherapy, patients in facilities, planned inpatient admissions, mental health and maternity wards, outpatients including diagnostics and care homes, prisons, care homes. This is nothing to do with the general outdoor public, especially not healthy people who are not sick and not being cared by medical care facilities. These documents show nothing supporting anything about the general public of healthy people. But so the citations here of one of the only 2 theoretical opinion models that got the World Health Organization to overturn its decades of guidelines from 2019 against community-wide masking for healthy people is This quote here, that although symptomatic infection can be problematic in terms of increasing spread, citation number 4, it can also be beneficial. Higher rates of asymptomatic infection with SARS-CoV-2 lead to higher rates of exposure, as was seen with antibody campaigns in Japan. It goes on to say, exposing society to SARS-CoV-2 without the unacceptable consequences of severe illness could lead to greater community-wide immunity and slow down the spread. Can you guys imagine what would have happened if someone like Trump had said this? What would have happened? The insane backlash would have come from the far left, from Antifa, from anyone, from literally anyone who supports COVID-19. I mean, I myself got removed and terminated from social media for saying this exact same thing, and literally for citing this from the studies. And yet, it's what the World Health Organization itself has accepted in order to overturn their decades of science against masking for healthy people. This is not over. The more we expose the actual science, the more scientists will begin to fight back against mere political activists, which are nothing more than simply domestic terrorists. I mean, that's literally what domestic terror is disrupting a government for political agendas, or public health for that matter. So it goes on to say the World Health Organization did not recommend population-level face masking in April, citation number 2, but changed their guidance on June 5th, 2020, citation number 3, when the extent of transmission from pre-symptomatic or even asymptomatic individuals was clear. And she cites Monica Gandhi, she cites citation number 4, and citation number 5. And citation number 4 is another one of her own opinion papers. Another Monica Gandhi of UCSF from Berkeley, which is, again, it's a false theoretical opinion model. And it's titled Asymptomatic Transmission, the Achilles Heel of Current Strategies to Control COVID-19, published May 28th of 2020. And citation number 5 is Temporal Dynamics in Viral Shedding and Transmissibility of COVID-19, which is also itself a disputed and corrected opinion theoretical paper, a theoretical model paper. And so in that paper, at the very top, we find matters arising to this article was published on August 17th of 2020, much later, months later after it was published. An author correction to this article was published on August 7th of 2020. The article has thus been updated. And the refutations of that false disputed theoretical model, came from two Oregon scientists, Mark Slifka and Lena Gao, and their paper is reply to is pre-symptomatic spread a major contributor to COVID-19 transmission. And so again, citation number 5 is a theoretical model by two World Health Organization public healthers, Eric H. Lau and Gabriel M. Leung, on pre-symptomatic spread, quote-unquote, based off of PCR cycle threshold of 39, which is literally non-infectious and non-viable above a 35 cycle threshold, as we fully explored for over an hour long all of the studies and all of the science at the beginning of this film. Yet they themselves argue in their rebuttal to the correction paper that, quote, PCR and viral load alone is not a viable or sole means of determining infectiousness, which is utterly false and absolutely untrue. It is utterly false, because the truth is that PCR and viral load absolutely is the means of determining infectiousness of a virus. Absolutely it is.
Threshold of 35 or more, that the chances of it being replication competent are minuscule. You almost never can culture virus from a 37 threshold cycle. So I think if somebody does come in with 37, 38, even 36, you got to say, it's just dead nucleotides, period.
Which we fully covered and fully explained and explored the science and the publications in the beginning of this film. So they go on to say, One recent model showed that population-level masking is one of the most efficacious interventions to reduce further spread of SARS-CoV-2, allowing for less stringent lockdown requirements in countries adopting this strategy. Citation number 6. Which is absolutely unfounded. Because, again, that's simply based on a recent model, a theoretical model. It's not based on actual real-world studies. It's not based on actual evidence from the highest tiers of evidence. And not only that, but the higher tiers of evidence show that this is entirely not the case. Literally everything we are doing is based on nothing but two theoretical and poorly designed false models, and Monica Gandhi's publication is based on the her claims in her publication is based on the poorly designed false hamster study on the effectiveness of masks to prevent transmission. So Mark Slifka, Division of Neuroscience and in Oregon Primate Research Center, and Lena Gao, Biostatistics and Bioinformatics, Knight Cancer Institute at Oregon National Primate Research Center, both debunked the study that the World Health Organization cited to overturn their decades of recommendations against community-wide masking. And what did they say in their debunking of it? They say that few studies have directly determined the proportion of transmission events that occur before symptom onset, or in other words, pre-symptomatic spread. But the recent modeling study by H.E. et al., which is the paper that the World Health Organization cited to overturn their recommendations against community-wide masking, and why everyone has to wear a mask because of this study here that the World Health Organization cited. So they're saying that it's a modeling study, and it inferred that 44% of secondary cases were infected during pre-symptomatic stages of disease. So that's why we all have to do community-wide masking, is because they think that they assume based on a single modeling study that there's pre-symptomatic and asymptomatic spread. But here they raise the questions regarding the approach and interpretation of the H.E. et al. Transmission model. For example, one male subject began with a low but detectable viral load cycle threshold, which was 39 at day 1. And again, 39 cycle threshold, that is non-infectious. A 39 cycle PCR threshold, that is literally non-infectious. Anything below 35 cycle threshold, as Fauci himself said in the beginning of the film, 39 cycles is not transmissible. It is not a culturable or a viable sample of viral load. It's literally just simply dead nucleotides at 39 cycles, meaning that it's completely null and void. There was no asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic transmission based on a 39 cycle PCR threshold. But they go on to debunk it even further. If individual peaks in viral load are found to mostly occur after symptom onset or after the first available viral load time point, then this may indicate that the current generalized additive model and derived average trend line do not fit the data well, and that individual peak infectiousness may be more similar to previous studies that found throat swab tears peaking after symptom onset, or in other words, not pre-symptomatic. In other words, only transmissible once symptoms have occurred, after symptom onset. They go on to say, in the H.E. et al. Model, which again, this was the model that the World Health Organization used and to overturn their recommendations against community-wide masking, the study did not include observed incubation period data and therefore used a previously published incubation data period based on observations from only 10 subjects. 2.5 days before symptom onset, but because this is not biologically possible, one would have to assume that 1.5 days is both the start and the peak of infectiousness, which is a biological implausible scenario. Although the levels of infectious virus needed to achieve COVID-19 transmissibility are unknown, the best way to determine transmission potential is from carefully conducted epidemiological studies that determine the proportion of pre-symptomatic versus post-symptomatic spread. A review of several case studies found multiple instances of transmission before symptom onset. However, it is difficult to determine the proportion of pre- and post-symptom onset transmission from individual case studies because there is little to no information on the number of asymptomatic, pre-symptomatic COVID-19 cases that had close contacts but did not result in a transmission event. Modeling studies can provide in the value in the interpretation of epidemiological data, but as noted previously, as well as by Professor Ioannidis countless times, COVID-19 models are highly dependent on assumptions built into them, and sometimes can be misinterpreted.
Unfortunately, major institutions, universities, major journals, they still trust a lot of modeling that is very unreliable. They publish lots of it, probably with very sketchy peer review among other modelers who are just willing to promote and self-promote this type of work. I think,
for example, one model that estimated the transmission rate of undocumented infections per person was 55% of transmission rate of documented infections, and undocumented infections were the source of 80% of the documented cases. Although referred to as evidence supporting an important role for asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic transmission, the term undocumented infection included mild, limited, or lack of symptoms because cases, many of which were not likely severely symptomatic, reflected a large range of potential spreaders. This modeling study should not be confused with transmission solely by asymptomatic, pre-symptomatic COVID-19 cases. Despite the utility of modeling studies, the most informative data often come from direct observations. For example, one study found that 31% of transmissions occurred prior to symptom onset. By contrast, another COVID-19 study of 19 asymptomatic cases and 5 pre-symptomatic cases found that only 4% of cases result in secondary transmission. Although it's unclear how long these individuals had been infected while in close contact with others prior to diagnosis, this low rate of asymptomatic pre-symptomatic transmission may be due in part to hospitalized in isolation during the outbreak. Interestingly, other secondary transmission studies have shown that although symptomatic cases transmitted COVID-19 to 16% of household contacts, asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic spread to household contacts was not observed. 0 of asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic spread to household contacts. Comparing these small studies is useful because it confirms that asymptomatic and pre-symptomatic spread is possible, but also places the results into the full context of how commonly these types of transmissions might occur. Interestingly, studies on SARS, a related coronavirus with a similar R0 value to COVID-19, provide analogous results. Symptomatic SARS cases spread the disease 15% of close contacts, whereas 0% of close contacts to SARS cases during the pre-symptomatic incubation period became infected. 0% of pre-symptomatic for the SARS, which is similar reproductive R0 rate to COVID-19. In terms of larger COVID-19 studies that calculated the proportion of pre-symptomatic versus post-symptomatic spread, a study examining 468 COVID-19 cases in China found that 12% of transmissions occurred prior to symptom onset. So by now it's become so glaringly, brutally obvious that masks and lockdowns and social distancing have absolutely no effect on the outcomes of various populations, despite dramatically different approaches to suppressing the virus in many different areas, different states, contrasting countries from country to country with the same overall viral curve, despite any of the measures taken given the regions of where these areas are outbreaking. Hello everyone, my name is Cullen Smith. I'm a published author. Today I would like to introduce you all to my brand new published book, The Hive Mind Invasion of Civilization, a compendium of esoteric science, symbolism, and universal secrets. If you'd like to purchase this book, you can head over to my brand new website that I've set up. It's still very bare bones. There's a lot of work I need to do on the site, but for now it's got the basic things that I need on there until I upload all of my content. You can sign up for the newsletter to receive email updates on all of my posts as I begin to populate the site with all of my archives of articles, books, videos, and films and courses and all of that good stuff. So you'll get notifications as I begin to populate the website with all of my content on it. So that's a good reason to sign up right now, even though there's no content on it yet. But you can pick up my books there. I've got my Hive Mind book. You can pick up and also support Lifting the Veil and the work that I do in the process. So feel free and head on over to my brand new website, liftingtheveil.tv. And I will see all of you there. All right, have a great day. Thank you. My name is Cullen Smith. This is Lifting the Veil. You can find all of my full books, presentations, videos, films, articles, posts at subscribestar.com/liftingtheveil. Patreon has suspended this work and my account and income stream for this content. So if you are a supporting patron, then please, I ask you to move your support over to subscribestar.com/liftingtheveil. And I have just established a completely free, uncensored, totally free speech social media platform that replaces Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, every other platform all in one on liftingtheveil.locals.com. You can download the Locals app and you can join our group and have totally free speech and totally uncensored, unrestricted content access. And there is also a ton of exclusive content, and I will leave the cited reference links in the description down below. So you can check that out for all of my full content, and I will see you guys in the next video. I rely solely on word of mouth, and the recommended algorithms are not recommending any of my videos or films anymore. My channel has literally been completely restricted, so I rely on your help by sharing my work around if you appreciate it, and leave me your comments. I definitely want to know what you have to share and what you have to think about all of this stuff, and I will see you in the next video.